one.
Go ahead, Michael. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So what we're going to be talking about today is whaling. Whaling is probably, of all the ones I mentioned, the packet boats were just like very simple. They're just basically communications, the shipping to Boston, to the Cape and back. You had, all kinds of boats that really did different types of things. Whaling was the most dangerous by far. So I'm going to begin the report a little bit and go try my second slide, see if it works. Okay. So there are many history. I'm going to begin with a really old history for you, but just to let you know, whaling goes back quite a bit. Whaling goes back to the at least to the 500s, if not before, the 600s. The two known people we knew, or even before Americans did, obviously, the Vikings did an awful lot of whaling. What the Vikings did, though, they basically went for blood. They did not go for blubber. They were just like taking long trips in their longboats. And as they were in the ocean, if they came across a whale or had proximity to a whale, they would spear it and they would just eat it right then and there, just part of the meat. They just kind of very basic type things. The Portuguese in about the year 1200, they were the first group of people who were formally they were into the process of whaling. And then from between the year 1100 to 1500, the Basques in Europe, which is the country, the area right between France and Spain, Catalonia, the Andorran region, they were heavily into whaling, and they captured the whales. And what they did was, especially during Lent, especially during that Lenten time, they processed the meat and they called it la de carême, with the very old French word capois. Pois in French means heavy. Poudre, the poudre of something is the heaviness of something. So they would make this very heavy meat, and they would use that for Lent. That was called, every Friday you have to have Lent. So that was basically it. So Vikings are on your left. They went along their merry way and they captured a whale there and then. And the Portuguese, a picture of the Portuguese, they were in the 1500s and they used a whole different reasons for whaling. What kind of whales would they use? Well, there are all kinds of whales, but you definitely want to get a sperm oil whale of some different types. There are both 5 or 6 different kinds of oil whales. You had sperm whales, you had blue whales, you had right whales, you had many different types. The sperm whale is by far the biggest. They're over 100 feet in length and on times. The right whale, which got its name, by the way, by the process of whaling, because they were just the right size. They were big, but yet not too big, and they were kind of slow in their feet, so to speak, slow when they were swimming, and they were easier to capture. So the right whale was really big. Humpbacks, bluebacks, or other kinds of whales. The man, by the way, you just really kept caught a couple of days ago. The man was swallowed by a whale. Remember reading that in the paper? He was swallowed by a humpback, which is usually about 65 feet in length. So the whales, as you know, the biggest whale would be the sperm whale. They are the largest. The blue whale would be the largest mammal in the East. And the right whale got this name because they were the correct whale, the right whale, not because of its geographic location, but because they were plentiful and they were easy to contact, to capture, so to speak. One thing which is amazing when you think about it, whales are mammals. And the reason why whales are mammals, I'll just tell you 3 things about that, which surprised me. Number one, they give birth live, which that I knew, but they give milk through the breast. They have the mother of the whale gives, and also they have breathing capacity through their lung. So those 3 characteristics make it a mammal. Even though they're 100 feet long, a lot different looking than we're looking, but they're considered the same species. They're all mammals. So whales are odontocytes, very large heads, very large brains for the most part. They have a larger brain. Most whales can go down to a half a mile to a mile and stay underwater for long periods of time, up to an hour, sometimes even longer. Skin is very tough and very rugged. They have sometimes a 14-inch skin. Tail is the largest part of their body, and as we go on a whale hunt, that's what you basically see. You see the whale, and you basically see, maybe you might see the blowhard, you might see the water coming above, but basically you see them swimming away or playing, and that's the tail coming up. Whales are known throughout the world. Different countries have a different name for it. I had the fortune of studying in France one time. My first job was a French and Spanish teacher, a long time ago, in high school. And there's a primer called a baleen et l'escargot. It's kind of like a little um, identified snail that attaches itself to a whale. And this whale goes all over the world. And they teach children in France, preschool, kindergarten, look at my adventure. The whale actually is talking through the snail is talking to the whale about the different things that he was doing. Here's a woodcut. It was in the year 1500, and to show you the whale, it has been around for a while. So they did devour whales. They did cut them up. They did it for size, and they were very popular at the time. What do we know about the the indigenous people, our Native American people who were here way before the European population? Well, we know a few things. We know that the women did a lot of fishing on themselves. They were responsible for anything near the coast. So the indigenous people, if a whale would become driven ashore, they would be out there harvesting. They would harvest that blubber. They would get out there and they would do something about it. So that's called drift whaling or offshore whaling. When you grab just a whale happens to come in. We also know that the Shinnecock tribe in Montauk, as well as the Aquina tribe, they basically had a ceremony, it was a religious ceremony called the Padawe, and the head chief would go out, they would capture the whale, they would go out in large 4 or 5 different boats, and they would circle the boat around and try to get the whale to come back to the shore. If they could secure it in ropes, that makes their job a lot easier, and they eventually drag the entire whale back to shore. But that didn't happen often, but it did happen from time to time. Let's talk about why whaling became so popular. I'm going to talk about the internal parts of a whale and why it became the most popular and the most valuable item that is used in America for a long time. Most of these words you probably know, but I'll just go through them for you quickly. A baleen is that little fiber-like material inside the mouth of a whale. And they use that for skirts, for dolls, for brushes, for combs, for different types of things. The ladies would make their corsets and their hoop skirts with that. Inside the jar, this was a filtering system. So when they would gobble up large schools of fish and then filter out through their intestines, things of that nature. So the baleen is very important. The tongue's important too. The tongue, sometimes the tongue could weigh sometimes up to 20, 30 pounds. The tongue on a whale is fairly large. It was considered a delicacy, and it's still considered a delicacy even today in Japan and Norway. King Louis XIV is known to having these exquisite long dinners, and he often had the whale of the tongue as the main entree. Also, the invertebrae, the bones, the inside of the whale are very, very important. They could bend these things. They had different processes that they could use, and they could shape it. They can make chairs, they can make chess pieces, they can make all kinds of things. I met as a child, I didn't know the importance of it, but I had a chess set. I don't know what happened. I think I gave it to my grandson, but I had a chess set carved out of ivory, out of a tusk whale, out of the tusk. Whale oil is the main reason why whales are important. Between the years of 7, but that's right after the Revolutionary War, whale oil was used to light homes. That's basically what the whale oil was for. Very popular. A little bit later, perfumes came into being. The early colonial people would mix it with tar and oakum, and they could use it for tarring substance. But basically, it was made from blubber. That's basically what they did. And some of it would also be used as an elixir. So you see pictures in like the 1820s of these sideshows and people selling these, medicine shows. That also would come from a whale as well. Ambergris is another part of a whale. It's kind of, I hate to say it, but it's part of their digestive tract. It's their bile, it's their fecal matter. And it's used, believe it or not, for perfumes. It's used for tinctures, used for dyes. It's considered very rare. So that little piece that you see there could be worth many, many dollars. They say kilogram is often worth about $50,000. Today, the whale, they do it by synthetics. They don't quite use the whale for those products today, very, very rarely. Spermaceti is another product that comes from the whale. It's a waxy substance found in the head of a whale. And they could use pomades, they could use textiles, they could do dyes, certain medicines. Spermaceti is like gives the buoyancy to the whale, makes the head kind of float in the air a lot easier. It's also used in the early American days for hives. If you got beaten by sting by bee, or you had hives as a condition, that would be another reason you would use spermaceti. A very big use of the whale oil too. We know that we made candles with wax. We know about that. There was what they would do then. What they would do, they would actually dip the wax oil into the whale oil, and that was called lumera. It was called it made it last a lot longer. So if a candle could last 2 hours, if you dipped it the right way with the right compost, you could get sometimes 5 or 6 hours. So the early days was interesting. If you look at the 1700s in colonial America, pre-colonial America, right before the Revolution, and even after, each town, Dennis, Yarmouth, all the way through P-Town, all the way through, had different laws. If a drift whale comes on your territory in your neck of the woods, who had the right to claim it? Well, they had a couple of rules. Every town had their own local ordinances about that. In most cases, it was finders keepers, but yet you had to immediately claim your piece, so to speak, and make your way out off the beach with it. If you couldn't do it, what they call improve it. If you couldn't improve it right away, then it was basically you had to bring it theoretically to the town trial. I'll explain that to you later in a minute. Interestingly enough, Native Americans, once the Europeans came, Native people were not allowed. If they showed themselves on shore, they were not given permission to cut up the whale or have any part of it, which wasn't very nice, by the way, I might add. In 1692, Nantucket used to be part of the New York colony. We call it New York State now. But William Mary felt that island, those two islands, were a little bit too far away. So they gave the island back to the Bay Colony. They gave it to Massachusetts. And Massachusetts took the colonies, but Nantucket was also seeking an industry. It's like, we're in the middle of the ocean. How can we survive? So a logical thing to do is to get into whaling. So that's exactly what they did. Right before the 1700s, I hired a man, Mr. Paddock, who was a pretty well-known whaler, and he came to Nantucket to train people, and they admitted people into Nantucket, and they had like schools basically. And for a number of years, he actually trained a number of people to become whaling. This is like an enterprise. The town said, we now have something we can claim as our own. So that's one reason why Nantucket became so prevalent. Now, when it first began in the 1700s, look at the Cape Cod population. There were about, in the year 1700, there were about 300 Europeans, but there were 1,200 indigenous people. And very little sense of equality was bestowed to the native population. So what do they use them for? Use them for an inexpensive workforce. The women would stay near the shore. They would gather mollusks and clams and things of that nature. But they would get the men, and the way they would do that, they would allow the parents to buy things from the store. They had trading posts in stores in the town, and they would keep a ledger. You owe so much money for different foods, and they would encourage them to buy things. Once they had incurred so much money, then they said, in order to pay your debt off, we would like to have your son, normally a very young son, 15 to 20, be typical, to come on board and work as a whaler. And that too, on top of that, they were given kind of the lowest rank on the ship, and which is general help, and their duties would be very dangerous. We know that the whaling population was very dangerous. By about 1 1/3 of the indigenous people who worked whales were either injured or severely hurt in the process of their career. Let's talk about how whaling now became a little more popular. Still talking a little bit in pre-colonial America. We had the drift whale. We had what's called coming ashore. That was kind of the picture on the right-hand side. Then they usually even like a larger ship, and they could herd the whale to the ship. You see the whale attached to the side of the ship. Once they could throw ropes and different pulleys and stuff around the whale, they were able to drag it all the way, ship it back to the coast. That's a technique they could use. And you see on the right, that's called a try. That little apparatus where they would take the whale, cut it into chunks, put it into a steamer, cut it into different pieces. Every town in Cape Cod, Yarmouth, Dennis, everywhere had a try. Each town had a try. They also had salt pork too, by the way. So when you drive through Cape Cod, you'll see Salt Pork Lane, you'll see Try Lane, you'll see reminiscences of what every town had in pre-colonial America. Once they began the concept of putting a try on a ship, now they could stay out even longer, because now the ships can go out, they can go out 30, 40 miles or longer, which they needed to do eventually to capture these whales, cut them up, save a remnant of it, and then capture maybe 2, 3, or even 4 at a time, and then come back to shore. So that's kind of like a revolutionary aspect of growth for the whaling industry. So how did they get the whales to shore? I think there was a number of ways they did with herding. They would normally have a number of small ships just kind of coalesce and herd the whale back to shore. That's another way of doing it, much more cumbersome, but it was used. As far as the equipment, there was a lot of equipment, different, very specific equipment for whaling. And we know what a lanyard is, it's for the rope. So the fastener, that was a very secure way of keeping the whales together. They have the canvas nipper, because once these long coiled ropes, they put them in a bucket. Once they secure the whale to the side of the boat, they would go in and go out with these ropes really quickly. So you got to protect your hand, your fingers. So they had a thing called a canvas nipper, which is an object you put on. It's not quite a glove, but it did protect your hand. The other picture of a try work. You brought your blubber, you brought the entire whale, as much of the whale as you want, to the town. Cart to bring it to a try. They say the smell is, I never had the experience, but they say the pungent smell lasted sometimes for weeks. Was a very odoriferous situation. People say who were there. I was some people even in the 1900s who were alive and talked about it. It took a while. They didn't do it instantly. It took a while. And the town who did it, they would get a percentage, and also the person who did the delivery would get a percentage of the take. So there is kind of like a ranking system as far as the staff members go on the whaling. So obviously the captain got the biggest chunk of the pie. They all have written contracts. So that as you got hired, recruited, they always have a formal written document that would go on record. The captain got the biggest chunk. Then they had made sometimes the first, second, sometimes even a third mate if it was a big enough boat. It's not unusual for the first captain to have even a spouse sometimes. A lot of times people think women didn't do this, but women, a lot of times the women, Captain Pendleman, for example, his wife is an avid, she won them on several occasions, brought the entire family, his sons with them. The next one in the rank would be the harpooner, the boat steerer, they call them. And they made some good money. They were the next tier. Then you have what they call skilled workers, the cooks, the coopers, the carpenters, they had specialized jobs. Then you have the ordinary seamen, which is, basic. Then you have the cabin boys, and then the general help. So depending on your rank and depending on how much work you had to do, you took in a percentage of your take. So there really were a lot of careers. The picture you see on your left is in New Bedford. So you can see that when they were not doing active whaling, it took them sometimes 3-4 months to working on a whaling boat. They had to clean it, they had to prepare it, they had to repair different parts of it. Those whales are quite strong. There's lots of different things that the whales would do. So you sail weavers, the carpenters, food prep. There are a lot of different careers that are related to whaling. So many people made their careers in whaling. All right, what happened in Nantucket from the year 1715, when they really went actively into the enterprise, to the year 1745? They went from 6 ships to 60 ships. So they did pretty good. And they went from 600 barrels in the beginning of that century to over almost 11,200 barrels. 15 captains to 85 captains. And more than half the town was actively engaged as a principal vocation in whaling. So you can see why whaling became such a big thing in Nantucket. The picture below is like 1900, so that's not an accurate picture for that era. One thing I came across in my reading of whales was interesting to me. Benjamin Franklin, who was a tremendous scientist, as you know, had a very active mind. He asked a research question. He said, why does it take 25% longer to sail from Boston to England than it does a return trip? So he had his whaling captain, Captain Folger from Nantucket, keep charts. He did 4 different trips. And he measured things like heat of the water, wind speed, density, salt in the water at different points within the ocean. And he gave all those facts back to Benjamin. And Franklin come up with a theory, there must be a stream. There must be a concurrent stream that actively flows in that direction. And he's a pretty bright guy because he's pretty accurate. So most of his findings are right on target. One of the first known prominent whales that we know was a fellow named Benjamin Banks. He's from Brewster. He kept a 20-year log, which, by the way, I have not gone to, but I've gone to the museum, but there's a separate place in the museum in New Bedford in whaling, we could actually get access to his logs. One day I'm going to get down there and see if I can decipher and make sense of that log. But he kept very careful records, and he himself was a slave owner. He himself was known to have both indigenous slaves and African slaves in both types. One day he noted that he came upon the shore of Brewster and there are 400 whales driven to shore. These are pilot whales. They're not technically a member of the whale family, but it's a much lower species. So he was a prominent whaler. Right before the American Revolution, but Wellfleet could claim a very active role in whaling. In 1771, they had built in the Welfare Harbor, about 30 whaling boats were made right there. Each one would be over 75 tons, and more than half of the town of Wellfleet was involved in whaling. There was a tremendously big fire, unfortunately, in Wellfleet that burned the harbor down. Who knows? Maybe it would have become, I don't know if it would have competed with Nantucket, but it was definitely a big whaling industry. All right, so how did the American Revolution impact the whaling industry? Well, it impacted a number of ways. First of all, if you were captured either in the army or the military and anywhere on sea or land, you were given three choices. If the British captured you, you can go to jail and they could send you over to Europe. You could join the British Navy, they would impress you, or you could become a British whaler. So the British people, they want to get into the act too. They wanted to make a little bit of money as well. So they tripled their fleet. They went from 100 to 300 ships in a very short period of time by impressing all these people, mostly American or indigenous people. 1,000 men alone from Cape Cod were killed from whaling ventures. It left over 202 widows and 340 orphan children. And then New Bedford became, just about the time New Bedford became a very popular site as well. For a short time, Providence, Rhode Island became popular too. Moses Brown made most of his money in two different ways. He was a slave, he was a slave trade, and in whaling. He made lots of money, founded Brown University, he and his brother. He had 200 active fishing ships in the year 1800. There is a collection there too, again, which I've not had a chance to go see in Providence, the Nicholson Maritime Collection, and they have logs there you can visit. But there's still more research to be done. I'm just scratching the surface here. There is a lot of additional information that you can find. So why did New Bedford become the whaling capital? Well, there are a number of reasons, but most people attribute a fellow named William Roch, who was a Quaker, who was a very staunch abolitionist. He wanted to go up to Hudson Bay, up on the river, and found kind of an economic opportunity for shipping. But then he realized this being in a river upstate New York was not going to be the best place to do fishing from. So he moved to New Bedford. He began a very large candle company. He began actually the largest candle company in the world at one time. He himself owned a boat called the Dartmouth, which was the very boat they used at the British Tea Party. And I would recommend this. I have gone to. There is a Roch Jones Duff House and Gardens in New Bedford. It's only open this summer. I think it's open in July and August. If you want to copy that name down, it is open to the public, and you can go through the house. It's a great garden. It's a very, very pretty place to go. So if you ever want to make a little day trip, it's not a bad item to go see. So President Jefferson actually made kind of a blunder in a way. He thought that embargoes would be a smart business move. Didn't turn out to be so good. He had Congress pass this 1807 Embargo Act, but most of the fish, all the commercial people, realized, especially the whales and the sea captains in general, all around New England, everywhere, they knew that 90% of their ships were at sea, but only 25% only delivered, which meant that they didn't go through the right process. I mean, they probably just sold it on the side, or they dumped it, or they were attacked, or whatever the reason. America was losing a lot of money. So in theory, it sounded like a great prospect to do, but I can tell you, I won't make any comments about embargo acts, but embargo acts has not been proven to be very reliable as an economic source. During the War of 1812, Captain David Porter, an American, was known for capturing British whales. He was a very famous fellow who captured at one time up to 12 British whalers. He captained the US Constitution against the Barbary pirates. You know the Marine song, from the holes of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Well, those are the shores of Tripoli. That would be the Barbary pirates. He was involved in fighting them at one point. At one point, he brought all of his 12 ships to Boston Harbor, just kind of as a bragging thing, and showed that they can be captured and released them. Back then, I guess you could take a man at his word, because this is the most unusual thing I've ever heard, but I think they kept their word. After he captured them, he would let the British sail of many of them just leave, as long as they wrote down in writing, "I will never fight against the American army again." So amazing, but it's apparently they did a lot of prisoner swaps as well. But that's a name that I found very interesting in doing some reading. Another fellow you might want to read about too is George Pollard, or the Lucky Essex. There was a boat in 1820 under the command of Captain George Pollard, was hit not once but twice by a very large sperm whale. And the boat was actually rammed so many times to a degree that they had to go on. They actually had to abandon ship, and a number of men, 20 men, made it survive by going on a side boat and with a very meager food supply. They eventually made it to an island, and there's been books written about this. It was actually reverting to cannibalism. There was nothing to eat in this very small island, so they began eating one another. So the oldest were first on the list, and so on. Two of the cabin boys, Tom Nicholson and Owen Chase, lived through it and were able to come back to New Bedford. They continued whaling even after that. I would say the golden age of whaling would be roughly 1820 to 1856. That's our biggest numbers. There were 900 whalers worldwide, of which the great majority were American. It was our biggest economy for a long time. Shoes and cotton were also really big. Obviously, cotton in the South, shoes in New England. Fleets at that point in time killed over 800 whales. Hundreds and thousand gallon barrels of sperm was produced, and sales was in the millions of dollars. I mean, back then, $1 million really meant $1 million back then. You could buy an awful lot for $1 million back in those days. Interesting fellow too that you might want to look at too. Absalom Boston was a Nantucket shipowner, a black Native American. He was the first big black whaling captain. All of his crew, 90% of his crew was black as well. Whaling was the one industry where it didn't make a difference what color you were. You could be indigenous, and you were given your rights. I mean, maybe not so much of the money, but you were being respected. You were given the same amount of food, you were given the same privilege of talking, which was interesting. He had an uncle who was equally famous. His uncle was Prince Boston. Prince was an interesting fellow. He was recruited as a slave to work on a whaling ship, worked for 2 years. His owner said, "I'm entitled to that right," which back in those days, there was a contract. If you owned a slave, the slave could not keep the money. You had to give it back to the owner. Well, he went to court, believe it or not. He went to a Massachusetts court, Prince did, and said, "I'm entitled to that. I earned it. I should keep it. That's what the law says I should be able to do." So the court said, "Not only will we give you your money, we found in his favor, but he's also awarded freedom." He was also ended the slavery as well. Another big name, which you probably know, is Captain Edward Pendleman. If you have a chance, go up to the National Park Service up in Fort Hill. At one point, he was considered one of the richest men in New England. National Park Service took over that. He owned a lot of land. He owned a whole stretch. I'd say almost a third of East End could be owned by the captain at that point in time. He retired at the age of 53. As I said, his wife would go often with him, and his sons went with him. I was reading a story one time. He brought a polar bear back with him. His kids thought it was cute, like a little cub. But guess what? The polar bear grew up. And once the polar bear got to be about 2 years of age, people in town were not too thrilled with the polar bear. So it wasn't very clear what happened to the polar bear. They had to move it somewhere. By the way, he always complained about taxes. He never liked to pay his fair share of tax. And this is before income tax. So this is just local, state, and town tax. Another name you might know in Peleg Nye. He comes from Sandwich. He was one of the fellows actually eaten by a whale. He was swallowed by a whale for a period of, I think, 2 or 3 hours. And there was a lot about him. Interesting guy. Nothing too remarkable other than the fact he was eaten by a whale. But he did go on to become a sea captain in the whale ships several months after that. And then we just read last week about another fellow who was eaten by a humpback whale. Another famous captain we might talk about too would be Augustus Inglefeld, another black whaler from Provincetown. He was one of our last active whalers. We know that he went out in 1902. They were still doing this. I think they have records of boats leaving from Provincetown out as late as 1909. So whaling was still a very prevalent thing to do. He was racially diverse. He became a head mason. He became the head mason in the community of P-Town. He was also known for his generous spirit, donated a lot of money, helped the indigenous people. He was just considered a very popular man for his day. Someone else that you probably should be aware of is Jonathan Bourne. The town of Bourne, Mass. is named in his honor. He was a very young man, 18, 19 years old, when he realized that, well, it's probably going to be our next big thing, in the early 1800s. So he couldn't wait to buy more stocks. So what they would do, you could buy a part ownership. It's like bearing out like a stock market. You could buy like 1/15 of a ship, 1/20 of a ship. So he began by buying small amounts, and then as he grew his wealth, he bought more. So eventually he became a ship owner. He owned a huge fleet. I think as many as 17 ships at one time. Also very active in politics. He ran for congressman, for local congressman, alderman first, and then congressman. Very good friends with Governor Oliver Ames, a well-known politician in Massachusetts. His daughter acquired his money when he died and used a lot of his money to buy a new library and new equipment for the town of Bourne. So when it came time to pick a name, Jonathan Bourne was the name they chose for Bourne. Another interesting story I came across too, there was another whale called Mocha Dick. Sounds almost like too good to be true story. Sounds like I'm making this up, or someone's making this up. But before we had Moby Dick, we had Mocha Dick. And there was a book published in 1876. He was doing his deeds, I think, in the 1850s, more or less. It was a very large whale that used to ram boats. He did it by the dozens. He would ram ships left and right. He did it. There are many, many stories about him. There's one story in the book, which is probably not proven, but it said in one of the last things he did, he saw a female kind of in distress on an island, and he managed to move a boat in that direction and smash it up, and that saved her life. So I don't know how true that is, but that was in the book. But he was an interesting, a white whale. So he's very, the skin, his outside flesh, was described as white as wool. So now we're going to go back to Moby Dick in a way, because in December 1840, Melville was a 22-year-old former teacher. He taught with a teacher first. Then he boarded a ship called the Acushnet, which was a whaling vessel, and sailed out of Fairhaven. On his 7th month on that voyage, his ship, Acushnet, crossed paths with a boat called the Lima. And they would have what they call a gam. A gam was like a popular term they would use. The sailors would just sit around and just have a gab session. They would talk. Sometimes this gab session would last 2-3 days long. At that point in time, I mentioned the two names before, Chase and I think what's the Essex. I got the wrong name there. But they're both crew members, the young cabin boys who worked on the Essex, were the two boys who were there. And they spoke for several hours about being whammed by Mocha Dick. So that's pretty much the origin of the Moby Dick story, at least a precursor of it anyway. Another small subtopic to talk about would be Scrimshaw art. So some, not all, but some sailors were very active and they were very artistic, some of them, not all. You had to bring a special kind of Indian dark ink on board to do this. You had a very crude needle that they would improvise themselves and make themselves. Back then, this art was not considered like a high art. It was considered like more like a hobby. But the ship, they would bring it back more as a gift. A lot of times the sailors would do this and give it to their wives, to their families. And today, of course, they value Scrimshaw art very deeply. If you can get an original piece of Scrimshaw, you have a very valuable commodity in your possession. But there's a lot of knockoffs today, so you have to be very careful. Another thing which I found interesting too, the Victorian age it lasted right through the age of Queen Victoria. She lasted until 1890, and there was a lot of Victorian interest in whaling and maritime art both. So they would have pictures of boats. A lot of times the Courier and I would have a magazine cover showing the whales. There's a sail whale kiss. They use postcards. So catching whales and sailors in general would be something that was very, very popular in the 1890s. Here's a very small poem, example of a popular whaling poem. What I consider the most popular whaling poem is Day 1891. Death to the living, long life to the killers. I think it talked with the ship captains who and the sailors who were out of the boat. Success to the sailors' wives, and good luck to the whaling men. That's the beginning of the poem. It goes on from there. So the whaling industry did finally come by a demise. Why did it end? It ended for a number of reasons. number one, the right whale was not prevalent in the North Atlantic seas now. Most of the whales, after like about after the Civil War in 1860, most of the ships had to go all the way around the Cape of Good Horn, all the way around South America, and go to the Arctic Ocean. And that took a long time. It was really, really tough. In fact, what many of the whales would do, with a famous Captain Cook out of Provincetown, he and many of his friends would go, they would ship their entire, before the winter, pre-winter, they would make the big sail, lock in for the winter, spend 3 or 4 months in the winter, and then as soon as spring come, they would start the whaling hunt. So it was a very rigorous thing to do that. Plus that and the scarcity of it. And then of course it became inoperable to do. America passed a law after the Civil War saying whaling should not be done. Even today in the Arctic Sea, some Inuits or some local indigenous people can do whaling, but very small whales in very small numbers. But the big ending was the technology. Kerosene lights and gas lamps came about, so there really wasn't a need to it. The Japanese today and the Norwegian people and even some of the Iceland people, they still permit whaling to a degree, and they still do it. I know the whale tongue is selling for large money, so they're still making money on it. So are they an endangered species? They are absolutely an endangered species. We know that in the 1700s, there are an estimated 20,000 right whales in the North Atlantic. This year, estimated about 350 are alive today. Also, the scientists are saying that they're diminishing. They're about 6 to 10 feet shorter now in total size than they were years ago. And they believe the major rationale for that, they're saying many whales are becoming entangled in fishing nets. So you read a lot of stories now about, you have to remove fishing nets, you can't have them so many, spaces between them. There's a lot of restrictions on the fishing nets. Of course, the fishermen don't like that because how it impacts their duty. So it's a very unusual thing to do. All right, so I'll give you some generic facts. Hopefully you can copy my email if you want to correct me, because I just got my information from books. If I said anything that was inappropriate or you found information to the contrary, it might be fully accurate. I just basically read as many books as I could find about whaling in the last 2 years. So by all means, shoot me an email and tell me what the correct information should be, or if I can just answer questions. I found the topic interesting. I hope you found it interesting too. I really enjoyed doing the research, and I hope hopefully enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you, Michael. Well done, and glad we got as many people in as we could scramble to get them in. If you got any questions, use the chat feature down below. And by the way, I'm glad Michael mentioned about the Roach Jones Duff House in New Bedford. It's really worth the trip, and it's a really nice house museum. So it is open now. It's open through October, and I think it was Nickerson was the other one you were thinking of, Michael, the other cabin boy.
Okay.
How long did it take you to accumulate this? How long have you been working on this?
Well, I'm doing a lot of research on sea captains in general. So I wouldn't say I specialize just in whales. But I've been I went to every historical society I could. I'd say about a little over 2.5 years. But libraries are a good source of it. Like I'm saying, there's many other places. I wish I could have gone to New Bedford. There's a Whaling Museum in Bourne, which I did not get to, in Providence. But eventually I'll do more. But I really enjoy doing the little bit of research I did do.
Yeah, so this is still a work in progress then.
Oh, there's more to it. A lot more information I could gather from this. I might turn into a book one day. By the way, I'm finishing my 3rd book. I'll just a very short side note. In Brewster, how I got me interested in sea captains in general. I guess I'm the local historian for the Captain Sea Quest, because as you know, each hole in Brewster is named after a sea captain, and there's nothing written about that. So I asked Mark if I could write a book about the sea captains. So if you go to either the library and look under my name, or look on the sea captains of the Captain Golf Course. My first book was about the Brewster sea captains. And I have a new book coming out in a couple of months called Cape Cod of Sea Captain History. So I'm enjoying it. I probably will write a little bit more as I go along.
You mentioned how guys were paid. How was it? What was it based on? Was it the catches? How did they determine who? What was it? What was the ultimate payout based upon, and when was it paid out?
So the way they would do it, there was like a pre-written condition. Everyone who were on a whaling ship, for the most part, had an agreement with the owner of the ship, not the captain, but the owner of the ship. And the owners usually were never on the ship, by the way, just the captains. Okay, so the first captain, the primary captain, he got the most money. And then the mates, first mate, second mate would be the highest. So they were the status. And the harpooner would be next, and then the skilled workers, and then cabin boy, and so on. So there were different ranks. And the way they would do it, when the ship came into port, let's say a ship came into Nantucket or Provincetown, wherever it came into, Providence, they would process the blubber. Money would be paid out based on how much blubber there was there. So every little inch of the whale was used, believe me, every inch was used by somebody. You would sell it to a vendor, and they would keep careful records. So once I had final records of all of that could take a while. By the way, that process could take 2 or 3 months. Once I know that ship coming in, you were on the ship, there is an amount of money coming to you, there's a percentage. So the general help might be given, I'm making this number up, like 2%, cabin boys maybe 1%, captains maybe made 10%. So different rankings made different amounts of money depending on how many people there were and how much money. Really the generosity of the owner, of course, took the biggest amount. So it was really very, in a way, but it was good in the fact that indigenous people and black people were given equal, in a sense, equal because they could at least work. There weren't a lot of jobs open to indigenous people and black people in America at that point, but that would be one of them.
On that point, did you find anything that gives percentages of how many non-whites made up whaling crews in the United States?
No, the only thing I could find is everything I read from like I say, the pre-revolutionary colonial, up until the war, like the early 1700s, it seemed like most of the ships, like more than half of them, had Native American people to a large extent. Maybe more than a quarter, almost half of them were indigenous people. After that, after the Revolutionary War and beyond, not as much. Then it became more or less a white man endeavor, so to speak.
You mentioned that whaling's still legal in places like Japan, Norway. We also know that there's been pushback. What's the future hold for those countries? Are they are they still insisting that they're going to be whalers? Are they considering getting out of that?
Yeah, there is pressure. I mean, obviously there is pressure, but I think if the world, like, so to speak, if the UN, all those large world organizations, if they said categorically would want you to end and will sanction you if you don't, there's no sanction involved. So they're asking them politely. So if that's what they're going to do, I don't suspect that those countries will stop doing it. I think they will continue for a while. But again, it is a shrinking population. So if we're not careful, we could lose the whales. I got a feeling that there is some indication that it might be growing again, but the data on that is still preliminary. I'm not sure if we're right now we're at a very dangerous sport. It's certainly an endangered species at the very least.
What was the life expectancy on a whale ship? How many whalers were killed or injured on a typical voyage?
Depending on the year, the earlier they didn't have the technique done as well. So the early pre-colonial was pretty high. I would say it's almost a third of the people have either serious injuries or not. And sure enough, most of those people would be the indigenous people. So it was really dangerous. It was a very dangerous test. So in other words, in order to do the harpooning, that was dangerous in itself. But even with securing the whale, a lot of times you had to dive in the water as they were flailing, secure the ropes around them. That was dangerous. And they had to actually make contact with the whale. Their skin sometimes gave off an eminent, a toxic type of skin lesion sometimes. So it was very dangerous. I mean, what they did, a lot of what they did was very dangerous. Whaling ships, they varied in size. Some whalers could be as small as 25 men, some could be up to 100. So depending on the size of the boat and how far they went.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for making a point to reschedule this. I know we had some technical issues the first time. So thank you for making the time to do this. Continued success on researching this. I know it's still a work in progress. So good job with this. This was excellent work. So thank you for taking the time, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight in one of our Safer at Home series. So I appreciate this. Michael, good luck with this.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. It was my pleasure.
Yeah. Okay, good night, everybody.
Take care.